Hey, y'all, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show here on Reason and Theology, joined by Kyle Kopy and also Dave Gordon having a conversation here about a number of topics. We'll probably be discussing Pope Francis, German bishops, Bishop Strickland, just all kinds of things going on right now in the church. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing today. Gentlemen, welcome back to the show. How are you? Well, at least Kala, I don't think I've actually had you on before, so this is your first time here. So let me start with you. Welcome.
Very, very blessed to be here, Michael. Thank you. And I'm jealous. Are you on a couch right now?
I am on the couch right now. I'm
Man, I
lounging
I
out.
get
And by the way, check it out. Look what else I have here. I have my water in my beer stein. Or somebody actually corrected me and said this isn't a beer stein. They said it's a beer mug or something like that. But
it's like a large mug. Yeah, I mean, it looks like a
yeah,
stein. It's got the handle on it, but I think the
yeah.
steins are like ceramic or
Is that
whatever
right?
and can't be
Get it
glass.
right, Michael.
I don't know.
So I'm lounging out on my sofa here with my water and
This
yeah,
boy's
just
ready for
hanging out.
Thanksgiving. You got the belt like open and unbuckled, like making room and whatnot.
Yeah, pretty much. So, man, and welcome back to the show, Dave. Great to have you back on. How you been?
Good, Michael. Thanks a lot. And
Yeah,
it's been not that long since we talked because you were on
right.
our show most recently. What was that, last week? But
Yeah,
I'm pleased to be back on Reason and Theology. Great
yeah.
program, and as I always say, great service you're doing for the church, knocking down propaganda against particularly the magisterium and the reigning pontiff.
Thank you. Yeah, that I mean, it's something that has been on my heart to address. I mean, it's also just something that a lot of people just continue to bring up and say, "Hey, we really need some guidance here," and so I kind of see a need to address it. But yeah, good to have y'all back on. Like you mentioned, I was just on y'all's channel, and we had a really great and productive discussion there. In fact, for those of y'all who haven't seen it, go and check it out. It's Colin Dave Contramundum, right?
That's
Yeah,
it.
y'all go and check it out and hit that subscribe button and go and watch that video discussion that we had if y'all haven't seen it already. But yeah, after that discussion, I just said, hey, why don't y'all just come back on this show and let's continue a discussion because I just find these really helpful and I imagine my viewers also find it productive so they don't just hear me pontificating by myself all day long. So yeah.
When we put
It's
our powers together, we should just go like, to create Captain Planet for you
Yeah.
guys, like
with the
80s
rings.
cartoon aficionados with the green mullet or whatever. We should just be like
Yeah.
Pope splainers, Like I love how that's a bad thing now. Oh, you're a Pope splainer. You mean a Catholic? Like I'm pretty sure that's just called a Catholic where I
Oh,
come from.
Yeah.
yeah, I
It's
mean,
pretty crazy. Go
when
ahead.
we were coming up for a name for our show, Kyle and
Mhm.
Dave Contramundum, I was seriously considering Pope Splainers as like a serious name for the show. Dave, I couldn't push Dave to it. He thought that was too self-aware, too much of a
Yeah.
self-own. But seriously, someone's got to take it up. I was like, we're either professional Catholics or we're Pope Splainers or we're ultramontanists. Like, I want all that. Give me all
Kyle
that.
really wanted to go like a self-own with the name of the channel. I was like, I see where you're coming from, but that may backfire on us.
Yeah. I like it though. In fact, my wife was reminding me today that I need to make for the R&T merch store some Pope Splainer shirts. I thought, yeah, that is a good idea.
For sure.
So
I would
those will
buy
be coming
one
soon. You would get one.
at the right price, obviously.
To Mac 7 in the chat says Pope Splainer is the new papist. I think yeah. Yeah, I mean that's what the Protestant reformers would call us as papists, and so
Mhm.
now kind of the new reformers in the church, yeah, they call us Pope Swainers. That is analogous. I'm there with you on that. But well, since you bring it up, all right. So how do you notice people use the term Pope splainer? And maybe compare that to what you think it actually is. Maybe Dave, since you bring it up, let me start with you, and then Kyle, I'll get you to jump in and weigh in.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think it's ironic that people are using this term. I believe, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't a set of a contest coin this term? Wasn't this Pat Coffin in his little pet term for people who wanted to be faithful to the magisterium of Pope Francis? I believe that's the provenance, although
Hmm.
I would not stake my, like whatever reputation on it. Um, yeah, but it seems like, it's really easy to not have to engage with the material of what somebody is saying. If you can just label what they're saying, it sounds kind of, it sounds bad. It's a pejorative, right? Oh, you're just
Mhm.
one of those Pope splainers. Well, I don't have to listen to you. So I think it's a nifty little tool in the trad toolbox. So they can get around dealing with the very substantial weight of the arguments that particularly you, Michael, have forged a path making in defense of Pope Francis against many of the common fallacies, the facile talking points that people have raised against this Pope. And you've really brushed a lot of people back and rubbed them
Mm.
the wrong way. So I think it's a technique. It's a rhetorical technique that,
Yeah.
because as Brian Holdsworth said, which was kind of a cell phone against him, it's like, well, you do a great job, even better than the Diocese of Tyler, in kind of saying what the problem is with Bishop Strickland. And maybe perhaps I agree, or sorry, better than the Holy See or
And the
this
nuncio, yeah.
commission. Yeah, exactly. And it's like, well, then isn't that's a cell phone? But yeah, I feel like it's a way of getting around essentially your meaty arguments.
Yeah, I hear you. And Kyle, go ahead and weigh in on what your thoughts here
Yeah, I mean,
are.
it's
Yeah.
it's always like a knockoff of the mansplaining thing, right?
Mhm.
Too, and that was always like a real woke in terms of the woke terminology. It was like,
Mhm.
oh, you're being condescending towards women if you stand up for some sort of element of traditional patriarchy.
Right.
The man being the spiritual and temporal head of the household, for instance, being the protector, provider of the family. All of that stuff was seen as mansplaining by sort of the feminist mob out there. And that got applied somehow in some way to people who are defenders of the Pope.
Mm.
I remember kind of like when the turning point on this was, and I have to like fact check Dave on it. I he might be right about Patrick Coffin inventing it, but I don't want to slander the guy. But we'd have to fact check that guy. But I think he might be right because I remember that episode of Taylor Marshall's show, and it might have been even Coffin, your brother Tim on there, and Marshall, and they had Coffin on, and he was basically telling like his red pill moment with Pope Francis. I don't know if this is still on YouTube, but I remember watching it back in the day. And Coffin basically described, and the other two sort of affirmed him and saying, we basically hit a point where we were just sick of giving the Pope the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
We were sick of all these documents coming out and us having to explain it. And, my response was always like, well, you did that. And I did that too, and rightly so. I did that with Benedict the 16th
Mhm.
when he went on that what was that Peter Seawald interview where he's
Yeah.
talking about the Zika virus and
Yeah.
condoms for prostitutes and all that. I
Right.
remember doing the same thing with Benedict and even John Paul II. I came back to the faith at the tail end of his before his death there or shortly after rather. So I remember doing that to some degree. I would admit that in the Francis pontificate, there might be a little more that we do have to
Mhm.
defend out there, and I'm happy
Mhm.
to do it. I'm more than happy to do it. But yeah, I would concede that there might be a little more that we, things that we do have to address.
Kyle, if I might, and just jump in to say something, because this is I think central. This is a crucial point to draw, to make, and it's that the reason. And I might have been on that Coffin interview because I had a very similar interview with him on rules for retrogrades, um, and he gives the reason. Okay, you give the benefit of the doubt, but there's no doubt anymore,
Mhm.
as if we have now characterized Pope Francis as a progressive saboteur bent on destroying the faith. And now everything that he does is going to be looked at through that lens of saboteur. And therefore, because he's established a so-called pattern, and of course, this pattern that Rad Trad Sphere is noticing is built, it's predicated on false allegations most of the time anyway. But because he's built this reputation for himself, and because we've spotted this pattern, then we no longer have to give him the benefit of the doubt and our fealty. But the thing is, The Pope is sui generis. He's not just a normal man. He is guided by the Holy Spirit. He has particular charisms and the grace of state. And it's not just like if I know that Nancy Pelosi is, a progressive and she's trying to make America this certain way. And now I can kind of analyze everything she does through this lens of, okay, she's a social democrat and she's going to get us as far left as she possibly can. It doesn't work that way with the Pope. The Pope is guided by the Holy Spirit. So that's why this notion of, you don't have to Pope splain, and we now see that you don't owe him the benefit of the doubt. That's why that's errant.
Yeah, that's a really good point. In fact, it's been something that I've been wanting to mention because, as you're noting here, we have a greater obligation to give the Pope the judgment of charity compared to anyone else. I mean, obviously, you need to give the judgment of charity to everybody, but how much more to the Pope given his condition and his status? And so, um, but what I've noticed is this whole notion of Pope splaining. I've never really found that to be an impressive critique because I've already come from a perspective that I had to work through a lot of objections against the New Testament, um, especially from those who would adhere to the Old Testament but reject the New Testament, particularly Jewish apologists. And I've seen some of the concerns that they've raised against the New Testament's use of the Old Testament. And there are greater difficulties in harmonizing the New Testament with the Old Testament um, than harmonizing something that Pope Francis has said with the Magisterium. And obviously, I believe we can harmonize the New Testament with the Old Testament. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be a Christian. So clearly, I believe that. But look, I can go to some of the words of Jesus. It's an instance that I've brought up many times, and there's many other examples. But I think this is a pretty an interesting one, and that is in the New Testament. Jesus says, "No one knows the coming and the hour of the, or no one knows the day and the hour of the coming of the Son of Man, not even the Son of Man." So he's saying not even himself. But then, of course, we obviously believe that Jesus is divine, and that includes omniscience. So, is there not a contradiction here? Muslims and atheists and other skeptics would look at the New Testament and say, at the very least, this shows that Jesus wasn't divine. So for you Christians to believe in the Trinity, that's absurd. And if we were to go and say, no, here's what Jesus means by that, and here's how to understand it, a lot of people are not going to be impressed and they're just going to say that's Christ splaining. Um,
Scripture
and
splainer.
yeah, and scripture splaining or New Testament splaining. And I guess I don't find that to be a legitimate comeback. So whenever I hear a Christian use the term Pope splainer to try to dismiss any harmonization that we make between what the Pope says and some previous magisterial statement, I just think it's a little hypocritical because I think you as a Christian, you've already embraced um, more difficulties in your acceptance of the New Testament and the New Testament's use of the Old Testament, or some other difficult passages in the New Testament. You've already embraced those things despite the great difficulties there, especially if you maintain inerrancy, which I do, and many of the critics that would throw out the Pope accusation, Pope splainer accusation would maintain. You already maintain these things despite the great challenges. Shouldn't harmonizing Pope Francis with the magisterium and something in the past, shouldn't that be a cakewalk? It should be a walk in the park compared to explaining um, maybe Matthew's use of Hosea and applying that to Jesus when the context was Israel. Now, obviously, Jesus is the embodiment of Israel, so I don't have a problem with Matthew's use of Hosea when Hosea is originally referring to Israel in the passage, "Out of Egypt I called my son." He takes that passage that applies to Israel and he applies it to Jesus. I don't have an issue with that. But I do admit that is harder to harmonize than maybe some of the things that the Pope splainer critics find troubling. So, anyways, I that with that long rant there, what do y'all think about that? Maybe let me go to you, Kyle. Any thoughts on this?
Sure, yeah, I don't understand how people have this disconnect of logic as to where, we're totally willing and they're totally willing to do that with sacred scripture in
Hmm.
terms of clarifying that to people because I'm in the same boat. I came back to the faith very involved in apologetics against Protestants and
Hmm.
atheists and people of different Christian persuasions. And I spent a lot of time going through those biblical apologetics and listening to debates and participating in commentaries and things like that. And a lot of it was arduous work, and especially when you're doing it with scripture. And I think that's really the problem in the Protestant world, um, which I found out because I didn't come back straight to the Catholic Church. I was cradle Catholic, but sort of toyed around in the Protestant world for a couple years. And that's really what kind of dismayed me, was like, well, this guy has a pretty valid point over here, and this guy's got a valid point about the same scripture. And it's like they came to two totally different conclusions. What's your authority here? So
Mm.
they're willing to say that, well, that's okay for Catholics to do that in the world of scripture, but when it comes to something like papal documents and the magisterium and aligning those things, they're just not willing to do that. And this is where I think the principle of the hermeneutic of continuity
Mhm.
comes into play so much. And people think that's just something that Pope Benedict made up, but it's actually historical. I mean, they
Yeah.
may not have used that exact term in the history of the church and other magisterial documents, but the concept is there. I mean, going all the way back to the late 1800s. I just found this quote the other day. If you'll permit me to read it,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
sent
absolutely.
this to Dave, and I thought this was so mind blowing, and people just need
Mhm,
to know this stuff. So this is Leo the 13th, in an apostolic letter titled
mhm,
Epistola Tua,
mhm,
and he says this, quote, it is to give proof of a submission which is far from sincere, to set up some kind of opposition between one pontiff and another. Those who, faced with two differing directives, and this is, obviously, this is talking about probably canonical procedures here, but the same should apply to doctrine, is what I argue. Those who, faced with two different directives, reject the present one to hold on to the past, are
mhm,
not giving proof of obedience to the authority which has the
mhm.
right and duty to guide them. And in some ways, they resemble those who, on receiving a condemnation, would wish to appeal to a future council or a pope who is better informed. I mean, a lot to unpack there and a lot to
Yeah.
apply to our current situation. So you do have to read current papal magisterial documents in the context of not only what that pope said previously, but what other popes said previously. And to
So
do
you have a duty to pope-splain.
you do, yeah, you're bound to it. That's what I would say. You
That's
have
what
to
I was
do
gonna
it.
jump in with, Kyle. Actually, it's a logical conclusion. Like you can draw the inference that you must pope splain from a few facts, right?
Mm,
Number one, you have a duty to assent to the non-definitive teachings, even of the Roman Pontiff. That's Lumen Gentium 25, right? And um, also, truth can't contradict truth. So
mm,
if we're saying what the previous pontiffs have taught is true, then this other thing that we have a duty to assent to, that is true, it can't contradict the other truth. So you must find a synthesis of the two. You must find a way to make them both fit. So we have a duty, a logical duty to pope splain. There's it's just the rational thing to do, given our ecclesiology, our understanding of how we must respond to the magisterium, especially in light of the Second Vatican Council. It's the only logical thing to do is to pope splain. So you can't accept Lumen Gentium 25 and not be a pope splainer, assuming that maybe the teachings of the modern magisterium sound different. They have a different tenor than prior statements of the magisterium, that it doesn't automatically just completely mesh. There are some perceived, not necessarily actual, but
mhm.
perceived contradictions. You must ask, well, how then can we synthesize these two things and kind of tease out a rule? What is the synthesis of these things, and what is the rule that is the truth of both statements?
I'm so glad you brought up LG 25, because now that reminds me, Donum Veritatis gives us the principles on how to pope splain, and actually shows that, that we have to do this. It's a document obviously written to theologians. And if this applies to theologians, it also applies to everyone else who's doing theology. So, internet personalities and people of that sort. So, what it notes is that if a theologian is having difficulty with something in the merely authentic magisterium, like you said, Lumen Gentium 25, your non-definitive teachings, or your third level teachings in the profession of faith. What Dona Veritatis notes is that the theologian, first of all, has a duty to harmonize that with previous teachings of the magisterium. That's the first duty. You don't just get to automatically say, I'm just going to withhold assent. No, you have a moral obligation to harmonize what the magisterium currently says with what something it said in the past, even if it looks like on the surface it's in conflict or there's some tension there. This is the duty of the theologian. So if a theologian has to do that, everybody else also has to do that.
Yeah,
And
but
then it notes
okay.
rare cases where a theologian, if the problem and difficulty still persist after they've done their best to harmonize these two teachings, but they're just unable to. In rare cases, they could withhold assent of intellect and will. That no longer allows them to. That does not allow them to start to bash the Pope or dissent against him on social media. In fact, Dona Veritatis has guidelines against that. But again, the whole point here is that it's basically saying you do have to pope splain. So, Kyle, I think you were going to say something there.
Yeah, I mean, the unfortunate thing is, Michael, we have not just, lay people with no theological training on podcasts doing this, but we have actual theologians doing this, as you pointed out. Very problematic, very unfortunate that situation with Dr. Ralph Martin. Ralph Martin, who currently teaches at my alma mater, Sacred Heart Major Seminary in Detroit, went on Pints with Aquinas. I mean, you did a show on that, I believe, addressing those concerns, and he was saying that Pope Francis is wanting to shred the Word of God. I mean,
Yeah,
these are, I mean, outrageous statements. I cannot believe he did that, and I respect Dr. Martin very much. I've learned from
sure.
him over the years. He was great in the new evangelization, but unfortunately somehow he may have missed this. And I actually, I mean, full disclosure, I emailed the rector of the seminary today, and I posted your video in the reply, and just asking him, is this, will this be addressed with Dr. Martin? And I don't do that just to make a big stink. I'm legitimately concerned about a very good man.
Yeah, and not just theologians, as you're mentioning here, but also bishops and cardinals. We have some of them also violating Donum Veritatis, unfortunately. And again, Donum Veritatis is magisterial, so that's binding on cardinals and bishops as well. So it's kind of sad to see that. Um, but what's also interesting here is that um, I kind of feel like the old guard and some of these other theologians and figures who they were there to fight liberalism and progressivism and battles that were occurring when I wasn't even alive. You know, the old guard, they were there fighting those battles and they did a great service to the church. I feel like those guys who are still around today, they're falling left and right in today's situation because though they were great in those battles, we have a very different battle today and it's exposing some of their deficiencies. And that deficiency specifically would be how to understand the magisterium whenever you think it's saying something that you don't agree with. That was something that they didn't have to encounter as much whenever they felt like the magisterium was saying exactly what they already held to, and they were fighting these battles with the liberals. Now they feel like, well, the magisterium is saying things they don't agree with, and they don't really know how to assent to those things and how to perhaps harmonize them. In fact, I even heard some of these individuals say, "Well, perhaps we were a little too hard on the progressives when we kept telling them that they were schismatics for dissenting against the magisterium. Perhaps that was a little too rash because now they're the ones doing it themselves." But again, now that the tables have turned just slightly, I think that it kind of shows they had a deficiency in their understanding of how the magisterium works, and that's being uncovered now. And that's why you're starting to see some of these heroes of the faith are starting to fall, because we're fighting a new battle, and that is a battle on the other end of the spectrum where you have radical traditionalism, or pseudo traditionalism, as I also call it. Um, and again, it's on the other end of the spectrum, versus the battles that they are used to fighting from the progressives. Dave, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I do think we are in a battle against the neo-Protestants, and that this is something that's not just like, Dave Gordon, Kyle Kopy, Michael Lofton, but this is
Sure.
something that Cardinal Ratzinger saw too in fighting back to reclaim Vatican II, and to preserve it not just from the left and the
Mhm.
bastardizations that and liberties that the left took with it, but
Mhm.
also from the right and the dissent that came out of that. He makes expressly clear in Ratzinger report that fidelity to tradition means fidelity to the Second Vatican Council, and that's
Mhm.
something that we've lost in this day and age. So more and more as we delve further um, down the road of the post Vatican Council path, we're having to defend it against a lot of the criticism that's become enshrined
Mhm.
in the kind of traditionalist talking points. People are starting to take things for granted. Oh, it was a modernist council. Oh, this is the natural fruit. This dysfunction in the church is the natural fruit of the council. And it's not only an accident of it, but it's something that was planned. So we have to fight these battles. As a matter of fact, I think one thing that we're going to look back on with the Francis pontificate and almost in a sense be appreciative for. And I don't deny that there have been some troubling
Mhm.
things to come out of the pontificate. Um, one of the things that's going to be a great service to the church is actually exposing who has theological faith and who are the true
Mhm.
believers in Catholicism that are going to hold fast even when the road is rocky and times are difficult and sometimes they don't really understand, but they're like, you know what, I might not understand this, I might not exactly know how to synthesize what the Holy Father is saying with, say, what Pius X said or something to that effect. But you know what, I'm gonna be faithful, and I'm gonna trust that the Holy Spirit is guiding the church. It's separating those types of people from the people who trust in their own wisdom. The Catholic hobbyists who they like to follow church news.
Mhm.
They don't have any other hobbies, so they make this thing what they devote all their free time to, and they really trust in the wisdom of man, and it's not a saving faith, it's not really a supernatural faith that they have. They might have um intellectual assent to the truths of Catholicism because, hey, let's face it, we have some pretty good arguments, right? And to that point, we might almost be a victim of the soundness of our reasoning and like the 13th century manualists and what came after them. We might be a little bit of a victim to that, and just because we've made the arguments so compellingly, we've never
Mhm.
really had to take much of a leap of faith to be like, yeah, yeah, I believe in the magisterium. I'm a son of the church. Uh, Especially people who don't have facility in theology.
Mhm.
Since when do we need every Tom, Dick, and Harry second guessing and parsing out every word that the Pope utters or writes? It's bizarre. And the hubris of a lot of people to be like, yeah, my name's Bill, I've got a GED, but I'm going to go ahead and say the Pope's a heretic because I didn't understand a few words in the latest encyclical. It's an act of madness, and it's caught on. And this pontificate in particular has shown who the loyalists are. Like, I am going to be a loyal son of the church. There's nothing that can happen because of the promises of Christ. The promises he's given us that he's going to be with the church until the consummation of the world. I trust Christ, and my trust in the church, my faith in the church is rooted in my faith in Christ and my faith in the inerrancy of Scripture. And that's not going to be ripped from me. It's a true faith. It's a theological faith. I'm not a Catholic hobbyist. If I'm going to
Mm.
do something for fun, I'm going to go like play sports or something to that effect. Um, we are exposing false faith and kind of Catholic fanboyism.
Yeah, this is a good observation. You know, it's Aquinas and Newman have both pointed out what you're pointing out as well, and so it's a really good observation that you're making because these two theological giants, Newman right over here, yeah, they picked up on this as well. And what they would say is that there's some people out there who they hold to what the Catholic Church teaches, but not by faith, but merely because they're intellectually convinced of what it teaches. But as soon as the magisterium says something they don't like, since they don't have faith there, assent does not kick in. They're second guessing, as you mentioned. That is what kicks in. That disposition of dissent kicks in because they weren't really holding to what the Catholic Church holds to because they hold to its authority. They were rather holding to certain theological propositions, and it just so happens that the church agreed with them at that time. And that's why Newman started to critique people who, prior to Ineffabilis Deus, with the Immaculate Conception being dogmatized, he says there were people who were converting to the Catholic Church who they affirmed everything that the Catholic Church taught up until that time, and they would even say so in their profession of faith when they were received into the church. They would have to make a profession of faith, and they would say, "I believe what the church teaches." But he says what they really meant was, "I only believe what the church teaches up until this time because it so happens to agree with me." But as soon as Ineffabilis Deus came out and the Immaculate Conception was dogmatized, some of these people say, "I didn't sign up for that. That wasn't the church that I joined. The church I joined didn't teach the Immaculate Conception." And so at that point, they started to dissent against that dogma. And how reminiscent is that of people today? They'll say, "I didn't sign up for a Morsa Titia or this death penalty revision. I didn't sign up. I signed up for this other stuff, under Benedict or John Paul II." And it's just the same error repeating itself all over again. And it's just showing that people ultimately are judging the magisterium rather than letting the magisterium guide them.
Yeah, it's
Kyle,
just
jump in here.
it's cafeteria Catholicism just on the right.
Hmm.
Because I grew up with cafeteria Catholicism on the left. I knew couples that were, they go to church every Sunday, but they're like, "Oh, I don't agree with the Catholic Church's teaching on contraception. Pick and choose. I'm not going to choose that one." And they would do
Hmm.
the same thing, and it was usually with, the sexual moral issues. But that was the Catholic dissenting, the cafeteria Catholics on the left. But what we're now seeing now, and they've always been around, but
Hmm.
more mainstream now, is the cafeteria Catholics on the right,
Hmm.
who usually out of ignorance because they don't understand some kind of phrase or whatever in some papal document. They're like, "Oh, that doesn't sound good to me, and I think that's what that means, so I'm going to reject that." It's usually a rejection of some sort of straw man or a misinterpretation of what the document's actually saying. And just to your other point about the faithlessness that we see amongst many people who claim they are conservative Catholics. Look, I mean, they need to follow their logic, their thinking to its logical conclusions. In that, okay, let's concede that they're all right. The Cardinal Mueller's argument that Pope Francis has taught a multitude of material heresies or something like that, and Desiderio, all those signers are correct, and the one before that, and the one before that, and on and on, Amoris Laetitia, whatever. We concede all that. Do you realize that what that does to the church? Like, why are you still in the church? Like, you're
Yeah.
conceding that the church has defected. If the foundation, the cornerstone of the church is telling you, not just telling you off the cuff, but magisterially telling you false things,
Yeah.
then the church has gone astray. And then the church is not the true church, and we should all just go home.
And
Kyle,
is binding your conscience to error,
Yeah.
I was just going to
especially a
jump.
soul destroying error because it's heresy, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
And that's a problem. I think that that's kind of the underlying error of our time. And that is the notion that the magisterium can teach heresy whenever it teaches non-definitively or non-infallibly. I just want to say that there's no way to really maintain that and to say that your church is practically functional and productive.
Yeah.
If the Pope can teach heresy every single day in a new encyclical, as long as it's not ex cathedra, he can teach a new heresy every single day, and he can do this, and popes can do this for 2,000 years. But, it's okay. The gates haven't prevailed because you have a few ex cathedra teachings that have been preserved from error. I don't think anybody could take that seriously. They would say, well, your magisterium is effectively useless because if we're limiting the guidance of the Holy Spirit merely to those instances and everything else can be just up in flames, then it just seems like functionally your magisterium isn't really any better than anything else out there.
It's not attractive. I mean, if I was an outsider looking in at that type of stuff, I'd be like, your church is a dumpster fire. Why the heck would I join your church if the leader of your
Mhm.
church, the guy you're telling me that I have to follow, is leading me astray? Oh, yeah, I want to join that team. Sign me up, coach.
Yeah. No, and like it would contradict the words of Christ, feed my sheep. But if I have
Mhm.
to second guess everything that the Holy Father is saying and draw upon my own wisdom to kind of, hyper scrutinize it, well, how am I going to get fed by my pastors? How is that possible? Because then again, it's all going back to my own wisdom. Another problem, and we talk about this a lot, but Kyle, you bring up the cafeteria Catholics on the left and on the right. Well, you can't have the cafeteria Catholics unless you have the lunch ladies that are feeding them their sloppy joes. And that is, of course, the lay magisterium that set itself up as the Catholic podcasting class. And the funny part about these guys, like they want to go toe to toe and because they read a few encyclicals and stuff, but the really one commonality among most of them, like 95%, is they're just dudes. They have no bona fides. Like, what are your creds? It's bizarre. This is the one like little niche cottage industry you can get into and have no training or experience to draw on. It's like if I set up a medical help channel and I was just like, yeah, you're sick, you got a cough, take some penicillin. I read that in a book somewhere. But I'm not a medical doctor, and most of these guys, like, I don't know if we're gonna name drop, but let's look at some of the big platforms out there. It's like you're not a theologian though. Why are you telling me this? What how it's the blind leading the blind. And it's actually because some of these guys have big platforms, it's actually like theological muggles that are setting the talking point for a lot of the plugged in to social media lay, quasi faithful.
Honestly, from now on, I already now have the image of certain YouTubers as a lunch lady right now with the gloves on, the clear plastic gloves on, handing me a sloppy Joe.
Who
That
was the
that
lunch
image
lady?
will
Thumbnail.
forever stay with me now.
Is
Who
that
was that
thumbnail image, Michael?
in the SNL skit? Who was it? It was Adam
Chris
Sandler.
Chris Farley.
Chris Farley was the
Slop.
lunch lady, right?
Yeah.
Make sure those
That's
sloppy joes are
that's
sloppy.
epic. That's a good point that you make. It reminds me of Jerome kind of said the same thing. There's a quote where he was saying, if you want to be a doctor, you have to go and study, medicine. If you want to, be this, you have to go and study that. But when it comes to doing theology, a person thinks that they could just open up the Bible and interpret it for themselves without any theological training. And I was like, wow, this was going on even in St. Jerome's day. Seems like we have that same problem today as well. Yeah.
Well, we're
So,
not pot shotting, man. We're not being petty. Like, I feel like some people might like hear that and it kind of sounds petty, but what's the commonality between all of us guys? We've all gone to school for theology. So, like, we kind of have points to make here. It's not petty to be like, well, what are your credentials for making the claims that you're making? You're like coming out and undercutting the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith or dicastery for Doctrine of Faith,
mhm.
or these theologians, these bishops. You're supposed to have a doctoral degree in theology to be a bishop. You're coming out regularly and like undercutting these bishops. It'd be like if I had my own home health remedy channel and I'm always undercutting what doctors are saying. At a certain point it becomes natural to be like, well, what's your basis for saying this? You can't just be like, yeah, the magisterium's in heresy because bro, trust me. No, I don't trust you. That's what you have credentials for. I mean, it's actual rhetoric, right? Ethos, pathos, logos, right? and you've got to establish yourself as an authority. There's no ethos there, but people just follow along blindly because they see other people following along blindly. I think critical thinking's in order.
Mm. I want to shift gears here a little bit to the topic at hand, the topic of the day, and that is Germany, right? Kyle, you emailed me a message from Pope Francis, a letter that he wrote to the about the German bishops, and I thought, wow, this is interesting. Since you emailed that to me, let's. I'll go to you. What are your thoughts on it? Maybe set us up. Tell us a little bit about it for those who maybe didn't see my stream earlier. Let's talk about that.
Sure. So there's a great article by Catholic News Agency out there. This is what I emailed to Michael.
Mhm,
Maybe we could put it in the show notes. I think it's really great if everyone just read this document. But basically, it's saying that, Pope Francis is expressing concern about the German synodal way. And that, as I said to you, Michael, in my email, this just flies in the face of the narrative
mhm,
that, oh, you guys, look, Pope Francis is actually this is what he's doing with the synod, he's making it seem like all these subversive measures are coming at the grassroots level. It's like, we know the agenda is already set, by the hierarchy up top. They want to change the church's teaching on these timeless principles. And how they're going to do that is, not actually have the Pope just decree it because he, if he was going to do it, he would just do it. But no, they're going to go like kind of around the bush and make it seem like the laity wants these things. And the rad trad talking point is that this is what's the whole reason behind the synodal way is that they're trying to push these measures through and make it seem like it's laymen who want it to happen. However, what has Francis actually said about it? What did he
mhm,
say about it here? He's saying no. He's saying I am very concerned about what's going on in Germany. And look, as people have pointed out, look, yeah, should Francis be harder on disciplining the weird and bizarre and errant and dangerous things that are going on in the church in Germany? Yes, we won't get into all of it right now, but if you don't know what's going on in the church in Germany, it's a dumpster fire. But it's not
mhm.
just one or two bishops; it's like an entire conference
Yeah.
of bishops. So put yourself in Pope Francis's shoes. How do you actually discipline an entire conference? That's
Mhm,
going to take a while, people. It's going to take a while. I mean, I know we live in a microwave culture and we want things to happen overnight. If I was Pope Francis, I would just excommunicate the entire German church. That's not how it works. That's not how it works. Eventually, hopefully, we're going to start seeing, one, two bishops get picked off, apostolic visitations start happening. But this is gonna go on for years, and this is gonna be, something that's not gonna get resolved right away. But Pope Francis has said, at least he's making these kind of statements. He's saying that, the what's going on in Germany right now. This is a quote from
mhm,
Pope Francis is threatening to undermine the entire universal unity of the church. I mean,
mhm,
those are pretty harsh words right there.
mhm,
So if you ever wondered, well, is Pope Francis just letting the stuff in Germany go on? No, no, he's extremely concerned about it. Um, there's there's a really good quote in here as well, and I'll end on this. He says, you know, people are making a big stink about, oh, the church is, now synodal, and what the heck does that mean? And Cardinal Burke's like, that was never in the history of the church or something like that. And Pope Francis, he's right there with us. He says, "Look, he's like the church is not just going to be some big boardroom committee." He's like he basically said of the German bishops, what you're trying to do is trying to seek salvation in constantly evolving committees. That's a straight quote from the Pope. And you're so self-absorbed in dialogues that are rehashing the same themes over and over again. Wow, this is Pope Francis speaking. My goodness, I love Pope Francis. And he says, I couldn't believe this. He says, okay, Pope Francis, what is the solution for the church in Germany? Well, three things: prayer, penance, and adoration. My goodness. Do you believe Pope Francis said that? This guy must be Catholic.
and that's a shot at the Germans because he's saying they're not known for prayer, penance, and adoration. So I thought, yeah, that was interesting. Dave, what are your thoughts here?
Well, I mean, Yeah, it's really refreshing. But remember, he's come out against the German synodal way before, too. This isn't even his
Mhm,
first shot across the bow to them. He said that they're risking schism
mhm,
essentially previously, and
mhm,
people forget that or brush it off. And
mhm,
this is one of the most dangerous things that actually the slanderers on the extreme rad trad, I guess you want to call it the right, although it's not, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. The slanderers have said, oh, he's a Peronist. So they've created an unfalsifiable premise where that if Pope Francis says something bad or quote unquote bad, or that they can, color as dangerous to the magisterial teachings of their predecessors or Pope Francis predecessors, then that's bad. But if he says something that sounds good, like that would uphold the magisterial teachings of the predecessors and the constant and unbroken faith, then that's also bad because he's doing it. What's the term they always use? It's like disinformation
mhm.
essentially. He's being a Peronist. He's
Speaking
using
out of both sides of
tactics.
his mouth.
Yeah, he's buying himself a little bit of like capital so that when he does something to move the church, to lurch the church quote leftward, then people will be kind of desensitized to it, or it'll catch them off guard, and that's it. It's an unfalsifiable premise. Like, how can you say, given the rad trad talking point, that Pope Francis is simply a leftist Peronist, that he's done anything good? Because anything that seems or appears to be very strongly orthodox, it's going to be said that that's just a facade to
Mhm.
mislead us, to catch us off guard, to put us, kind of lull us to sleep while he's still, conniving and scheming and twisting his beard to move the church leftward. It's really bad thinking. It's such undisciplined thinking. And again, all these guys just fall into that trap. It's an echo chamber out there. And the sheep people that listen to them and actually get like their formation and catechesis from entertainers, from like Catholic entertainers, you know they don't question these things. They just,
Mm.
oh yeah, he's a Peronist. He must be doing something bad.
Yeah, the reason why I just can't one of the many reasons why I can't buy the Peronist thing is like, okay, well, he doesn't just say things. He actually puts into canon law and the magisterium things that you wouldn't expect a Peronist to do. For instance, 2021 decision, which he still upholds to this day, and even Cardinal Fernandez, right hand man, as late as September 30th, reaffirmed the church can't bless sin. So the church cannot bless gay unions. That 2021 decision of Pope Francis still being reiterated, still being held to by this pontificate. I mean, how could it change that? It can't change that. So that's in the magisterium. That's authoritative. Same Pope Francis has put into canon law, canon 1373, that automatically excommunicates a bishop who attempts to ordain a woman. Now, those two issues are at the heart of the things that Germany are trying to put, the German bishops are trying to put forward. They're trying to put forward blessing of gay unions and ordination of women. And Pope Francis has put into canon law and the magisterium things that prohibit that. And so he does a little bit more than just speak out against this stuff. He actually puts it into practice, into action. I think we could all agree that we would like to see more. Kind of as you mentioned there, Kyle. Some people say, I mean, why doesn't he just all excommunicate them all? I would just excommunicate them all. Look, I totally get that feeling. I kind of feel that way as well. But at the same time, um, if you were to discipline an entire Episcopal conference, most likely, since they're already in outright disobedience to the magisterium, they're not going to vacate their sees. They're not going to turn it over to some other bishop. They're going to keep that territory, and you're going to have a formal schism. So now we go from a state where Germany is, these German bishops are materially in schism, because they are, in my opinion. They're materially in schism, but they'll then be in formal schism. And what is the likelihood that we'll ever heal a formal schism? It's incredibly unlikely when it happens in church history. As soon as you have a formal schism, it's almost never healed. And usually that schism grows massively for centuries to come. And I think Pope Francis is saying, okay, before we get to that point, is there some kind of way to rein these guys in? And I can appreciate trying to do that and be strategic. I don't know if it's just going to come to a formal schism anyway, maybe, but I think he's trying to avoid it. So, yeah, I understand why the Pope can't just say, okay, I'm going to replace an entire Episcopal conference.
Yeah,
I
and the
could see
cast.
him replacing an individual,
Yeah,
one or two bishops, but an entire Episcopal conference, maybe not. Now, some people have proposed, well, why doesn't he just kind of make an example out of a few of them and just replace one or two? Fair enough. Fair enough. And maybe he needs to go ahead and do that. But an entire Episcopal conference, it's not just Germany. Now you would also have to do the same thing with the Flemish bishops. So you got multiple Episcopal conferences that you would basically be at war with.
yeah,
So
and I
it's
would
it's a
say
tough one.
that the pastoral nature of the Francis pontificate.
Mhm.
Given that, I would suspect that he would err on the side of really, really taking it slow and really trying to hear out both sides. I mean, it's hard at this point, given what their actions have done. It's hard to just kind of give them the benefit of the doubt because they're actually, committing things that are really bad in their actions. They're not just talking about doing it; they're actually doing it. But again, Francis is going to take it slow, and he has, and it remains to be seen if he's going to be a little more heavy-handed with it.
Mhm.
We've seen him be heavy-handed with other individuals just recently, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But I just I guess to finish up on this point, there is one more thing I wanted to point out. There's a lot of fear in the church amongst some members of the laity, and even some clerics are saying this, that Pope Francis wants to radically change the structure of the church, where it's now not just the clerics running things, but it's somehow the laity are going to be involved in more so these decision making processes. This is the whole fear of the synod itself. This is one of the things that I think Cardinal Burke pointed out in that Pandora's Box book. This is one of the things that was addressed in a recent dubia too. I think I forget which one it was. It was one of the ones that came out in the past couple of months of. I think it was the new Dubia brothers, Burke included, Sarah included, where they were like, aren't you trying to change the structure of the church or whatever? And the CNA article. I mean, a lot of things put it to rest, but here's just another one of them. CNA reports that chief among the Pope's concerns is a push to set up a permanent synodal council. So again, so the German bishops are actually at least trying to do this, or may have actually already done it, but they're trying to set up a permanent synodal council, a mixed body of laity and bishops that would govern the Catholic Church in Germany. And that's apparently a top priority for the German synodal way. And the Pope says no. Such a consultative decision-making body, as currently proposed, is not in alignment with the sacramental structure of the hierarchical church. So he's basically putting a stop to that. He's like, look. He's like, the laity are not going to be involved in the strict governance of a diocese, nor should they be, because that is the prerogative of the bishops and their helpers, for lack of a better word, the parish priests.
Dude, well, you know what's weird and it's frustrating is that there's always some explanation to kind of wriggle out of this. Even think back to like the Ottaviani intervention, with the liturgical reforms and whatnot. Once things were explained to him, when Paul VI explained some of the liturgical reforms and how they're rooted in tradition to Ottaviani, then he sends this missive being like, "Oh, I completely withdraw some of these objections that I had raised, some of these worries that I had raised turned out to be unfounded." But then there's always the talking point like, "Oh, well, that was his secretary who wrote that for him and he was going blind." Like, seriously,
Yeah.
that's what like Steve
I know.
Skojak
I
told
know.
me about that.
I know.
It's absurd. There's always some way to wriggle out of it. So you cite my canon law, Michael. And we also cite, what was the other example we cited? Pope Francis. He put in the excommunication in canon law for those who ordain
Yeah.
women.
Women.
But there was
Canon
a
17.
recent,
Yeah.
yeah,
1373. Yeah.
there's always a reason. The homosexual, you can't bless homosexual unions. That's the one I was trying to recall. people are like, well, that was the CDF, and they kind of snuck this past him and kind of manipulate. That was the talking point, right? They
I remember that.
manipulated him into signing it. That didn't reek of Pope Francis language. That was his CDF going behind his back, and then they like forged his signature on there and whatnot. So every time there's some like positive Orthodox development or something that is absolutely devastating to the trad narrative, they just a conspiracy theory, just writes it off. It casts doubts on it. What Marian apparition said, whatever, against, the Taviani intervention, or, like Our Lady of Knock must have said that this CDF document was a forgery and that Pope Francis didn't put his actual signature on that. There's always an excuse for it, no matter how, implausible.
It's the logical fallacy of covering one conspiracy theory with another conspiracy theory.
Right. What's that
It's like
called?
there's no way to falsify this thing. I can say anything at that point. It reminds me of the Benedict issue. You know, people would come up with this elaborate argument to say he didn't really resign, which was a bunk argument to begin with. Be that as it may, it's like, okay, even if that's true, there's multiple interviews of Benedict explicitly saying that, Francis is the Pope. He's not. He fully resigned. He looks to the magisterium of Pope Francis and his authority and all that. And so clearly Benedict is not under the impression that he didn't actually that he failed to resign or something like that. And then the cover up there, the conspiracy theory to cover up that conspiracy theory is that, well, he's being forced to say those things. Pope Francis has like a gun to his head, behind the camera or whatever, and he's forcing him to say those things. So it's like, there's no way to falsify this kind of stuff.
It was imposter Sister Lucia that had an AK-47 pointed at him, right? Or like, clearly it's obviously imposter Sister Lucia. People just drop that in there like it's nothing, obviously.
The imposter Lucy. Was there also an imposter Paul VI? I think somebody also said there was a Paul VI imposter.
I've never heard that, but I wouldn't put it past him.
And the same thing with this third secret. Well, the third secret has been released, but to cover up the original conspiracy theory of the third secret, they would continue another one to say, well, here's what it really is. Benedict can't really release the full thing because of this and that. And it's just exhausting.
Well, it's kind of like that cheating husband who gets caught in a lie, then he has to lie on top of his lie, and he can't keep all of his lies straight. That's what the trad conspiracy theories have become. Because you got to cover your bases. You don't want to walk back and say, "No, I was wrong." I mean, that's an act of humility right there.
Yeah.
And then too, I just got to point out, how dare you, Michael, controvert the illustrious Dr. Ed Maza on the Benedict theory. My goodness, Ed Maza has a political science and history degree. Okay, you need to trust this man.
Don't you love it when people say something outlandish to you, like, yeah, imposter Sister Lucia, and you're like, I don't really believe in that because there's no evidence for it that's actually, sound and convincing and that's reliable. And they're like, but you need to read this book. It's like, hey, I'm not going to read a book because some rando tells me his crackpot theory. I love that. If you just read this 350-page book, you'll believe just like I do. It's like, I promise you I won't because I'm not that gullible, but whatevs.
I got deep into the third secret stuff and when I had to retrace my steps, I thought, man, no, I was buying into secondary sources that were making certain claims, but then when you go to fact check them, it turns out they were actually providing information that wasn't false. So when people say, oh, you need to go and read this book, well, sometimes unfortunately those secondary sources will rely on faulty information, and unless you're going and fact checking them, you might not see it. So it might look convincing on the surface until you actually start to chase down the sources that they cite, if they even cite sources. Some of this stuff, they put the claim out there and there's no citation, there's no source. And it's like I could do that too. I could say that I was actually born on Mars. And like I could say anything at this point. If I don't have to substantiate my claim, I can say Paul the Sixth ordained me 2 years ago. And you'll be like, well, I thought Paul the Sixth died like decades ago. No, man, he actually survived and he ordained me. Prove me wrong. Prove to me he didn't ordain me and he didn't actually live. It's like how can I falsify? Like you can't falsify that kind of stuff whenever you don't have to depend on real sources to back up
Mhm.
your claim.
Yeah, it used to
So
be like, don't trust the citing Wikipedia or some random blog or something like that.
mhm.
But in the trad world, even the trad books, quote unquote books, they're also terrible. They're also just as bad as relying on Wikipedia. Because if my Sede Vacantis friends, give me a book, a Sede book, which that has happened in the past, and then I read the book, they're like, well, it's in the book. It's printed on a sheet of paper by some rad trad publishing company. I'm like, I don't care. The footnote either wasn't there or was bad or whatever. Yeah, Taylor Marshall published a darn book. Someone unfortunately published that book for him, but it's been ripped apart
Sophia.
by several different people.
Yeah, when you go through it, he makes a ton of claims in there, very significant claims, and in many instances doesn't provide a source for the claim. So it's like, okay, you made the claim, but I have no way to actually verify that. And it's really, really important to what you're trying to demonstrate. So you need to show the proof for these things. You can't just throw that out there because I'll do the same. Somebody, maybe Taylor Marshall puts in infiltration, some unsubstantiated claim. Here, I got one for you. Well, you know what? An anonymous cardinal in Rome told me that what Taylor Marshall said is false, and he has evidence that what he said is false. There you go. And now I don't give you any real way to verify what I just said. That this cardinal actually exists, that he really said that there's really merit to what he's saying. You just have to take my word for it in the same way you have to take Taylor Marshall's word for it. So we can do this all day long. That's not productive. You have to show actual evidence for the claims that you make whenever they're significant like that. And so that's why I just didn't think that the book was very helpful. One of many reasons, at least.
Yeah, I think he's a friend of your show, but I believe his name is Kevin Simons. Is that how you
Hmm.
pronounce his name?
Hmm. Hmm.
So Kevin did a great write up. He's actually done
That's
several
right.
iterations of it, I believe.
That's right.
And I think he's done some videos with you on it. But
Hmm.
if you want it in a kind of a concise written format, yeah, search up Kevin Simons, his critique of Marshall's infiltration book. He does a very, very thorough and scholarly job of debunking and raising a lot of questions with Marshall's research.
Yeah, River Run was on that one as well. Yeah. And in fact, that was a two-parter, so I'll put a link to that in the show notes, and y'all go and check it out, and you'll see some of the concerns there. Well, kind of wrapping it up here. We're about an hour into it. Maybe y'all can take it wherever you want to go. Anything else that y'all wanted to get in here? I'll just kind of open it up.
I'll
Kyle?
defer. I'll defer to Dave. No,
Dang
Dave,
it.
it's you.
Dang
Dave?
it. Now I'm on the spot. Well, I mean, we've never really said much. And I know you've covered it, Michael, on your channel quite a bit, but we haven't really waded in to the Strickland waters. And I
Hmm.
would like to say, it's funny how many people have come out swinging against the Pope on the Strickland issue.
Hmm.
And there's a couple like main themes that you see running through like their dissent, their kind of protests against what Pope Francis has done here. Number one is we're seeing everything through the lens of American politics. So it's like, yeah, Strickland, he's strong on LGBT. He's strong on being anti-abortion. He obviously professes a faith in the Eucharist. Not that that should be polarizing. He is pro TLM. Therefore, Strickland equals good. Like that is literally the extent of the calculus in some people's minds. He has said many bold things about these issues that I know to be true and kind of dog whistles for orthodoxy.
Hmm.
Therefore, he equals good bishop. And therefore, anyone who is censuring him or disciplining him equals bad pope.
Mm,
That's one of the main threads I've seen. Another of the main threads out there is just that, look, I don't know exactly what's happened, and the Vatican hasn't released this, and yet I'm assuming that it was not justified. Well, I don't know if I should wade into these waters because I haven't heard the full case, but come on, you can't justify removing this bishop from you know, his diocese. You can't do it. And it's like, but you just said you don't know the facts behind the case. So why then do you presume that there's some malfeasance on the part of Rome as opposed to giving them the benefit of the doubt that they're not villains, the scheming behind the scenes to take out good Orthodox bishops? I mean, there are several good Orthodox bishops, and they're not all getting punished or
right.
censured. Why don't you assume, as I would for any organization, obviously most of all the church, but any organization, if I see them, censuring somebody, I don't assume they're just doing it out of malice or because that person has a political view that they don't like. I assume that there's some substance there. And it all goes back to hubris too, what I brought up
Mm,
earlier. Since I don't have like rank pride, I don't assume to know better than the organization itself, or assume that I can judge their motives for something as an outsider without being privy to all the facts. And that's going on too. There seems to be an assumption of malice against Rome for removing this bishop, um, because there might be what people are calling like a vacuum of information out there that's been released, which obviously I think again shows like yours, Michael, where you're making a case like, well, he's made a lot of really schismatic comments and he's led a lot of people astray, and he's in disobedience on the issue of the TLM and Traditionis Custodes. And these are things that are a breach with his brother bishops and with the Bishop of Rome, and that's not excusable. But instead, people just come out swinging and are like, this bishop's good because he's really strongly against abortion, and he showed up to protest against these disgusting, despicable the LA Dodgers drag queen publicity stunt that they did. Or it's just, I don't know, so let's assume that Rome is acting with bad will.
Let's just say for a moment that Rome was acting with bad will and he was not removed for any legitimate reasons. Let's just assume that for a second here and play that out. Um, so, in the case of, for instance, Padre Pio, who was wrongfully disciplined, what he did is he not only remained silent, but whenever there was a crowd of Padre Pio fans who went out and publicly protested this decision, Padre Pio wrote to his bishop and immediately condemned the people who were defending him and speaking out in his defense. He condemned them and said, I completely submit myself to your decision and Rome's decision. And he was silent. He didn't go and join the protest. He, in fact, condemned the protesters, and he was vindicated. And we now venerate him as a saint. I have a first class relic of him right here in my chapel. We venerate him as a saint because of that, among other things. But I look at Strickland and I see him, instead of condemning the protesters, he joins them and continues to go everywhere and give interviews. And I just think, look, even if he is innocent, is this the best way to handle it? If there was ever a chance that Rome would have reversed this decision and vindicated him, I kind of feel like maybe that ship has sailed at this point.
You're right, because he did not and is not taking the Padre Pio route. And we know what happened with Padre Pio. He was eventually vindicated. It was a long struggle. He had to go silent for a while. Not that he was ever like, out there publicly to begin with. That wasn't his style. But he still submitted to the process. Didn't make a stink about it. Wanted to be as obedient as possible. And we can see that our Lord rewarded him for that. But unfortunately, we're seeing the opposite with Bishop Strickland. I mean, what has he done? As much as he talks about, and he'll go on these long rambling rants about how I'm just preaching the truth, and I don't know why they canceled me, but maybe it's because they just don't want the truth preached. He keeps harping on and on and on about how he is the only one or one of the only ones who is preaching the truth, and that's why he's being persecuted for it. First of all, yes and no. That's a mixed bag on that because sometimes, unfortunately, Bishop Strickland, with all due respect, you're not preaching the truth. Sometimes you say very problematic things. Along with your good stuff, you have said some very, very problematic things. Now, again, yeah, to play Michael's game of let's just assume for a second, let's concede that there's some conspiracy against Strickland. There's certain hierarchs up there, whether it's the Pope or some of his cronies, who just think that he's too conservative, too pro-life, too pro-TLM, or whatever it is. And he's too outspoken about all that stuff. So we're going to go get him. Okay. Did he not, even if that's true, which I don't think it is, even if that's true, did Strickland not give them the ammunition that they needed to remove him? I say absolutely. Unfortunately, he did because what do you have? I mean, you run through the litany all the time, right? Publicly accused the Pope of teaching heresy in a magisterial document, has promoted videos that called the Pope a diabolically disoriented clown, promoting videos like Michael Matt, problematic tweets that claim that the Pope is undermining the deposit of faith, and then the kicker, the recent one, the life site, the Rome Life Forum thing, where I still, this is incomprehensible that he read that letter aloud. And then, because we all know what the letter said, many of us do.
Sure.
Well, it basically promotes sedevacantist propaganda. And then, so the rejoinder on that, the Strickland splainers will say that, oh, well, you just ask Strickland. He's not a sedevacantist. He says all the time, I'm not a sedevacantist. I don't care. So just because you're not a sedevacantist, that means it's okay for you to publicly promote sedevacantist material. That,
Right.
what?
Think about it like this. I mean, one might not be a rapist, but what if they read a document promoting the act of rape? You
Exactly.
see what I'm saying? It's like, okay, well, just because you aren't this, you should have had better wisdom and prudence to know not to share this. And what's interesting now is that Strickland has come out and told us the reasons why. He initially, this is what's very troubling, is in one initial interview that he gave, he basically said he wasn't given any reasons other than what the Vatican said in its official statement. Turns out that wasn't true. Not saying he's lying. Turns out that wasn't true, though, because then he goes on the world over about a week later and tells us he actually was sat down the day before that announcement was made, was sat down by the nuncio and given a very long list on why he was removed. So it's like, yeah, okay, now we're finding there was more to the story than he initially told us. So he does know the reasons. He gave us several of those reasons. I responded to them and showed why I could totally understand where Rome was coming from on those particular reasons. So for anybody who's saying, "Oh, Rome didn't even, give any kind of reasons," well, they definitely did give reasons to him. Perhaps they didn't publish all of those reasons on the Vatican's website. Usually, that's done to allow the bishop to save face. But the bishop himself has chosen to come out at the very least and verbally tell us what some of those reasons are. And it's like, well, yeah, actually, what Rome is citing there is true.
Well, can I
Um,
make an analogy, you
mhm,
guys? I think there's
mhm,
an appropriate analogy. I'm going to go to American pop culture here, film
mhm,
culture. And there's a recent comedy. It's you got some chuckles in it called The Other Guys,
mhm,
with Will Ferrell and Mark Wahlberg. And
mhm,
at the beginning of the movie, you have the two cops that are kind of like the prima donnas, the showboats, and trying to get the high profile cases and kind of uh solve crimes in like a sexy manner, right? And be like the heads, the faces of this police force and show everybody like what good cops they are. And then the whole point of the movie, if I'm going to take it seriously for like its messaging and artistic merit and whatnot, which is kind of farcical, but the whole point of the movie is that it's the guys that really are in the back room grinding things out, not seeking the limelight, that are the actual good cops. And
Mhm.
the station chief is like, they weren't good cops. The two prima donna cops that was the Samuel L. Jackson and Dwayne Johnson. I can't believe I just called him Dwayne Johnson, The Rock.
Mhm.
They weren't good cops. They were bad cops. And that's the thing. And there's an analogy there for these outspoken prelates, right? Like, sure, when you see evil in your diocese or something that needs to be called out, call it out. You got to be firm. You got to be tough. You got to be a man, and sometimes go to war. And that's part
Mm,
of being a shepherd. It's part of being a man. But these guys that are always chasing a camera, that are flying around the country, trying to be figureheads at every, right wing cause, right wing Catholic cause, there's something deeply troubling there. And there are a lot of bishops that are good bishops. And I actually TA'd for a bishop when I was in graduate school for moral theology. And he's very orthodox. And he was low key and wasn't always trying to make political statements, but was
mhm,
an absolute son of the church, insisted on teaching in his diocese. And he wouldn't be the type to go out there and, necessarily fly to a rally.
mm,
Obviously, I think that, the way Gomez handled that, the sisters and perpetual indulgence thing in the Los Angeles diocese was weak. And I wish he had said more. But that doesn't mean that we have this idea of like America's bishop and he's flying around and he's chasing the limelight and always the one rushing the cameras and making the statements. There's something deeply spiritually off with that. I promise you, I've known enough high profile Catholics to know the intoxicating effect of our kind of pathetic low level like Catholic social media fame. It can actually really destroy people. And when you do become an outspoken bishop, because there are so few that that have the moxie and the pluck to fight some of these fights. It's not something you see every day. People are starving for it. So you get to go on like the podcasting circle, you get to make the rounds and people are patting you on the back and telling you you're a living prophet for saying like, it's not good to be gay.
mhm,
It's sinful to live a homosexual lifestyle, and you're some kind of a living prophet because you say abortion is bad. These people, it goes to their head. They read their press clippings. And then when you see them chasing that limelight, that's a real sign that something is spiritually off. And you guys got to use your critical thinking. And it's kind of surprising that that's the case, that fame can really, like, not even fame. It's not like they're A-listers or something, but like our F grade Catholic celeb fame could go to somebody's head, but it does. And it's really ugly and gross. I promise you that's out there. Like, we've all seen it, guys, right? Kyle and Michael, we know enough like high profile Catholics where that's a thing.
mm. Yeah, Kyle, any thoughts on this too?
Yeah, I mean, it's just such an unfortunate situation all around too, because on one level we have this hunger for bishops and priests and members of the hierarchy to stand up and be bold and be orthodox. And granted, we've seen a deprivation of that over
Mm,
the many decades with the bad priests and the bad bishops. We've heard all about it ad nauseum, and
mhm,
it is getting better to some degree. But you're going to have, I think, too, Satan is also going to get a foothold in certain clerics' minds that way. I'm not saying that's exactly what's happening with Strickland or whatever,
sure.
but it is a plan of attack for the evil one to get us obsessed with a certain cleric or whatever, whether we have these like rad trad Catholic celebrities. Unfortunately, it's guys who I agree with on a lot of stuff, and I've
Mhm,
appreciated some of the things
mhm,
they've done over the years. Cardinal Burke, Cardinal Sarah, Bishop Schneider, all these guys, the sort of the A-list rad trad clerics. But they've also done stuff, and we're not many people are not willing to call them out on the problematic things that they've done or said.
Hmm.
Mostly it's said. I'm not saying they're like
Mhm,
manifest,
mhm, mhm.
whatever with actions, but it's usually something they said. I just think of recently, like, was it Bishop Schneider's Credo book that came out, that catechism?
Hmm.
I mean, my goodness, and it's being promoted by Scott Hahn, unfortunately.
Kyle, I think Michael just had an aneurysm when you
Yeah, like, I'm
mentioned that.
just
the
oh.
book which shall not be mentioned, and it's like,
No, please
dude,
do mention it because I want people to know. I mean, I detailed this, in several streams. The most recent one, since you bring it up, was the fact that he brings up Pope Francis's Abu Dhabi document, where it speaks of God willing the plurality and diversity of all religions. And Schneider raises that in Credo as an instance of a Pope teaching heresy. What he doesn't tell you is that the Pope personally told Schneider he is referring to the permissive will. He then gave Schneider permission to tell people that. And then Pope Francis took the request that Schneider gave him, and that is to clarify the matter. He did just that, and in an audience, made that matter very clear. Um, Unfortunately, instead of Schneider helping the Holy Father bring that clarification to everyone, he perpetuated the false accusation by presenting to the audience in Credo that statement and then the claim that it's heresy. But he didn't show you what Pope Francis said to clarify and show that no, this isn't heresy. So instead of assisting the Holy Father and clarifying any confusion, he perpetuated the confusion. It's like one of many examples. So that's why I'm over here just about to have a heart attack when you mention Credo.
yeah, unfortunately, it's this situation we now find ourselves in with many of our, yeah, let's call them heroes. Many of the people that have helped us in our faith journey over the years. I mean, Scott Hahn's one of them. My goodness, the amount of people that he's helped through his biblical work, just to name a few things. But at the same time, these men are fallible. These men are human, and we often see this in the Protestant world. And this is maybe what some Catholics don't get, because they haven't seen that sort of dark side of the Protestant world, where you have this sort of hero pastor worship, and your entire faith, or a good amount of your faith, is dependent on a single person, and this single person can do no wrong. And then when that single person says something wrong or does something wrong, then your entire faith is called into question. So I think for a lot of the rad trads, that's what's at stake. My entire faith depends on these certain people that have led me along the way. Even if there's one of our listeners out there, let's say Taylor Marshall has maybe helped you in your faith life. I'll concede that he said some good stuff over the years, whatever. But then you have to also at the same time be able to critique your heroes. There was a song a few years ago by AWOL Nation called "Kill Your Heroes," and I'm not advocating for violence against anyone, but at a certain sense, you have to realize that your heroes are fallible people and they do make mistakes, and hopefully you would have the humility to acknowledge that and call these people out and say, well, maybe I shouldn't put all my stock in this particular person.
Kyle, you're my
I'm
hero.
a
I
little
wanted to kill you.
concerned that people follow certain personalities over and against the magisterium, even if they're clerics, bishops, or cardinals. I'm concerned that people follow them over and against what the magisterium says and teaches authoritatively. That's deeply troubling to me because ultimately we should be adhering to what the magisterium teaches, and anybody who is dissenting from that, especially publicly, that's an issue. That's a problem. I think that maybe people have some misunderstandings and they think just because someone is a cardinal, they think that they're authoritative. Well, in reality, a lot of these cardinals don't actually have an episcopal see. So they're not engaging in the magisterium on the local level. And they would only, in any other instance, they could engage in the magisterium would be if they participate in like an ecumenical council or something like that. and we haven't had one since the 60s. So a lot of these cardinals and even some of these bishops that you find online, they're not engaging the magisterium. They don't exercise any magisterial authority any more than any of us here do, you know. So now they might have a little bit more um, moral authority in some cases, but they certainly don't have any actual magisterial authority. And so I want to caution people from chasing after some of these personalities and adhering to them over and against what the magisterium teaches. It disturbs me when somebody says, well, Cardinal so and so says, or Bishop so and so says, and they say that to me in response to a document from the magisterium that I present to them. It's like, wait, hold on. No, this isn't the way it works. You don't get to overturn what the magisterium teaches here because Cardinal or Bishop so and so said something. That's
Mhm.
not the way authority works in the Catholic Church. And so maybe we need some better catechesis on the magisterium. I don't know.
Or
Well,
Pope Chad Ripperger said something like, well, here's what Pope Francis said, but Pope Ripperger said the opposite. One other thing that needs to get called out, you guys, and I think it's, especially with Kwasniewski, kind of spreading his errors around. I guess he's recently graced us with his Twitter presence. Is somehow that the Pope is not the head of the bishops, and that even in the Strickland case, like Strickland should have resisted the Pope and stayed in his diocese. I just want to read from um Christus Dominus, which is one of the
I wasn't aware. Did you say that Kwasniewski said this?
well, sure. Wasn't this a while back, Kyle? Didn't we touch on this in an
yes,
episode a while back?
there
Kind
was
of
the
telling
I don't recall this offhand, so this seems like news to me at this
month and a half ago, I'd say. He
yeah
was
the
anticipating what was coming and was urging the basically, Bishop Strickland to resist if he were ousted from his diocese.
Yeah,
yeah
that does sound vaguely familiar now that you mention it. Yeah, I'd have to go back and look. But yeah, sure, proceed. Let's hear it.
Yeah, here we go. Like the Pope is the head of, the bishops. This is a settled thing. He's trying to say essentially that the Pope, I don't want to straw man him by any means, but I think the thrust of his argument is that a bishop in his diocese is not answerable to, the Holy Roman Pontiff. So this is Christus Dominus Vatican II, bishops sharing in the solicitude for all the churches exercise their episcopal office, which they have received through episcopal consecration in communion with and under the authority of the Roman Pontiff. As far as their teaching authority and pastoral government are concerned, all are united in a collegiate body with respect to the universal Church of God. So under the authority of the Supreme Pontiff, this is a settled matter. The Pope is the head of the church. He's the head
Mm-hmm.
of the College of Bishops. And this
Mm-hmm.
is something that we're getting this quasi-orthodox, capital O orthodox.
Mm-hmm.
I would never attribute, regular orthodoxy
Right.
to Kwasniewski. We're getting this quasi-orthodox theology of quasi-orthodox episcopal theology
Mm-hmm.
coming out of some quarters of the rad stratosphere, and it's really dangerous. It's confusing a lot of people because it sounds plausible. Like, well, the bishop's the head of his diocese, so how can the Pope just waltz in and take him out of the diocese? It's like, well, the Pope's the head of the bishops, but beyond that, people are citing canon law at the Pope, and not like teaching canons that are rooted in the immutable doctrine or anything, but people are citing like just actual positive canon laws to be like, Pope Francis is breaking canon law. Like, do you know what a motu proprio is? The Pope can, he's the authority that issues canon law.
Yeah, he's
It's
above
not
canon
something
law.
that binds him. Right. Exactly. It's
Even canon
absurd.
law actually notes that he's the legislator. He's the one who promulgates canon law. He could throw out the code of canon law tomorrow if he wanted to. He could. Now that wouldn't be wise, but he could. He could literally just get rid of it tomorrow.
yeah
A
and
Vatican. This is a dogma of Vatican I. This is why I find it ironic because people are playing around with heresy now, and then they want to accuse others of heresy. Vatican I is explicit in its dogma, so it's heresy to deny this, that the Pope exercises full, immediate, ordinary authority over every diocese. Um, that is a dogma of the Catholic Church. So to cite canon law against the Pope's actions on the Strickland cases, to implicitly deny a dogma. So I suspect some material heresy on part of some people. It's funny you mentioned Kwasniewski in relation to this issue because this is public information. I'm not sharing anything private here. This is publicly known. It was in a public Facebook post. It was pretty comical. There was an individual who shared a quote with Peter. He didn't tell who wrote the quote, but he shared a quote with Peter about the authority of the Bishop of Rome, about the authority of the Pope. And the quote was provided to him. And Peter Kay said, "Oh, yeah, I agree with that. I'm fully on board with that. That's exactly my view." And it turns out this was Eastern Orthodox ecclesiology and the Eastern Orthodox understanding of the papacy that denies the dogma of Vatican I and effectively says that the Pope exercises his primacy only when he is in accord with the truth. Otherwise, he doesn't exercise any authority over any other bishop. And it's like, wait, no, hold on. That's Eastern Orthodox ecclesiology. That is not Vatican I ecclesiology. And he just straight up said, "Oh, I agreed with it." And then when it was revealed to him, wait, you do realize this was an Eastern Orthodox saint who's proposing Eastern Orthodox ecclesiology that is diametrically opposed to what Vatican I teaches. He's like, well, I mean, if he said it and it's true, it's true. And it's like, but yeah, it's contrary to Vatican I, though. So you're literally adhering to a deficient ecclesiology.
Well, at
So
least
I'm not
he's not a
surprised,
senior. Sorry,
Mhm.
Michael. I mean,
No, no, go
I
ahead.
I was gonna say at least he's not a senior fellow at the St. Paul Center. Wait, dang it. Never mind.
Yeah. Yeah, it was, I mean, I have to give Bishop Strickland props. I mean, I think he said it in the Aurora, interview, or at least somewhere recently, that people have been advising him to stay in his diocese and fight, and he's like, "No, I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna be
Right.
obedient here." Good on him,
Yes.
because you had Kwasniewski in July, what David was referencing here in last July. Um, uh, Dr. K did a episode with John Henry Weston where he basically, I mean, it's titled Bishop Joseph Strickland Must Resist Pope Francis If Told to Step Down, Dr. Peter K. And he
Material
goes,
heresy.
yeah,
I think that he can.
I'll send you that article, and yeah, Dave and I did a show about this back when it came out, and we couldn't believe some of the stuff that he was saying. He cited two things. He cited the removal of Bishop Torres in Puerto Rico, which there's some things, a lot of things there we don't know, but the Pope, justly, I mean, well, removed him, and Torres, I don't know if he resigned or was, what the situation was there, but he was removed by Pope Francis, and Kwasniewski said, well, no, he should have stayed and fought just like Strickland should do, because remember this was in July, and then he also gave some weird, what he thought was precedent for fighting the Pope as a bishop if the Pope is trying to remove you. There was this weird situation post Vatican II. I think in the 1980s, where you had this Eastern bishop somewhere in the United States, and he was, asked. He reached the mandatory age of retirement, and he was supposed to submit his resignation. Refused to do so, which he has the right to do. But then the Pope actually wanted to remove him. And this, well, he's not Eastern Orthodox, obviously Eastern Catholic,
Mhm.
and he had this wild claim of, well, no, the Pope has no jurisdiction over us because we're Eastern Catholics, um,
Uh,
right? And that's obviously wrong.
yeah,
And
that
so,
that would be a denial of Vatican I ecclesiology.
yeah,
And
full,
of course, as Eastern Catholics, we are obligated to adhere to the same dogmas as Latin Rite Catholics. And so, if you look at, and I've done shows on this, if you look through the Eastern Code of Canon Law, it explicitly gives the exact same levels of assent to magisterial authority as you'll find in the Latin Rite Code of Canon Law. Not only that, I mean, when you have all Eastern Orthodox churches represented at Vatican II and all signing off on Vatican II as an ecumenical council. And by the way, all of the Eastern Catholic churches adhered to 21 ecumenical councils at Vatican II. But Vatican II, as you mentioned there, Dave, in multiple places, affirmed Vatican I ecclesiology. So, according to Eastern Catholic, um, ecumenical councils, Vatican I ecclesiology is just as binding on Eastern Catholics as everyone else. Now, obviously, the way that practically works out, I mean, the Pope is can't the Pope should be less hands-on in other patriarchates and in other Eastern Catholic churches, as opposed to the way in which he governs his own patriarchate. He's going to be a little bit more hands-on there, but he still has that full, immediate authority that he could exercise if he needs to, even with the Eastern churches. Um, and in fact, you want that to be the case, because if the Pope doesn't have that, then ultimately we're going to end up in the same problem as the Eastern Orthodox.
Yeah, and Dr. K's whole argument was like, look, there's precedent for a bishop refusing to be removed. And I pointed out, I'm like, well, did you read the history of that? Did you see the fruits of that situation? Just real quick, what happened? This went on for like decades, going back and forth with the Vatican. The bishop refused to leave. The Vatican appointed a new bishop. Then you had this like diocesan wide schism where some people stayed with the old bishop, some people went with the new bishop. I mean, by your fruits you will know them, right?
Mhm.
So that one bishop's decision not to leave created a de facto mini schism within a
Mhm.
diocese. Is that unity? Is that the unity that we're called to have in the Catholic Church? No. That is exactly, and that's what Dr. K seems to want in the Diocese of Tyler by doing these things.
Yeah, I've just heard him affirm all kinds of things that just simply aren't Catholic, and so yeah, and in fact, I've covered some of that here on the channel. So I guess I'm not too surprised to hear that that view about the Strickland situation. So yeah. Well, anyways, wrapping it up here, y'all put in a plug for your channel. Tell me more about it, what y'all are doing.
Go,
Kyle?
Dave. Oh man. Okay, I'll
We
do it.
keep deferring to each other. Like
Well,
that's a tough question.
well, my name's first on the channel, because they forced me to put it on my name first. So it is Kyle and Dave Contramundum. That is the name. Search it up on YouTube. Kyle and Dave Contramundum on YouTube. We're currently not on any other platforms, for better or for worse. So if we get canceled off YouTube, we're in the wind. So please do sign up, subscribe, support us in whatever way you can with your prayers, perhaps financially, and we're going to bring you great content, like you see here, on Reason and Theology. And we thank Michael for being on the show, and we look forward to having him on our show, and again being on his show, vice versa. Once again, actually have a nickname for you, Michael. I don't know
What's
if
that?
I want to run this by you.
All right.
Michael Lofton, the Apostle of the Magisterium. What do you think about that?
I thought Pope Splainer was just kind of the one, I
Dave
thought
doesn't
I'd
like
been
it. Look
dubbed
at Dave's
the
face.
patron of Pope Splainers or something.
Patron
The
of Pope
patriarch
Splainer.
of Pope Splainers.
There you go.
Also, we got to say though, when it comes to our channel, like we're still doing our branding and stuff. So if you go to our channel and you see like our little thumbnail photo, up in the top left corner, it's kind of that like Simon and Garfunkel air. We haven't really ironed that out. We just threw that up there. We're doing branding right now because it's it takes time and whatnot. So don't judge the book by the cover. We're not actually that like Simon and Garfunkel-y. That Kyle, you did that to us, by the way. That is
I made it.
straight Simon and Garfunkel picture.
Yeah. Well, before it was just your mug on there, so I had to get that thing off of there.
There is that. Yeah. Just 1, 2, 3, not Garfunkel. Like we're just gonna be vying to not be Garfunkel, even though his voice was better. And Simon kind of stunk alone.
This is great. Well, hey, I'm looking forward to more collabs. We'll certainly be doing more together.
Cool, Michael. Thanks so much.
Thank
Y'all,
you.
thanks so much for coming on. And everybody, thank y'all for watching. Hit the like button and the subscribe button. Also, check me out, patreon.com/reason and theology if you want to support what I'm doing here on the channel. We'll see you later. God bless.